is the co-owner of Springtide Seaweed, a very active member of our community. She got her Bachelor of Science degree in marine agriculture from aquaculture from the University of Maine in Redmond, and her master's degree in marine botany from the University of Connecticut. And she is here tonight to tell us all about her operation in Frenchman Bay. Please welcome Sarah.
My name is Sarah Redmond, and I founded Springtide Seaweed in 2017. I'm actually from Litchfield, Maine, which is between Augusta and Brunswick, and grew up going to the ocean in the summers, and also in the woods on a homestead growing a garden. And so when I was in high school, I didn't know what I was going to do when I grew up, so I decided that I liked growing plants and I liked the ocean. So I just put them together and decided I wanted to be a seaweed farmer. Completely just made it up. Nobody thought I was going to do anything with it, including myself, but went to school for aquaculture. The University of Maine in Orono had a pretty good marine aquaculture program at the time, but I learned a lot about salmon farming and shellfish farming, and I did a lot of projects on Asian seaweed farms. There wasn't a lot happening in Maine. There's nothing happening in Maine. And so I worked in the wild fisheries for a while after school. I was a fishery observer for the National Marine Fisheries Service, and so I was able to go on almost every kind of fishing vessel, commercial fishing vessel in the North Atlantic, in the Northeast. So that gave me an interesting sort of education about our marine fisheries. And then I found a seaweed lab in Connecticut, ended up going to grad school there, figured out how to put together the first kelp nursery system, where I was able to produce the seed for the kelp. So was starting to realize my dream of being a seaweed farmer, but still hadn't really, it was all new, we hadn't figured out all the parts of it. So I was hired by Maine Sea Grant right after school, and that's how I ended up in this area. They put my office at the Aquaculture Research Center in Franklin. I don't know if some of you are aware, there is a research center. It's the site of an old salmon hatchery that was associated with a salmon lease site in Sorrento. There's 35 acres that was associated with the business that was operating out of Franklin. They went out of business a long time ago. The university bought the place at auction, and it's sort of like this strange research / business incubator facility. So I was a marine extension agent for seaweed aquaculture, working out of Franklin and helping people figure out how to grow seaweed, how to set up nurseries, what to do with seaweed, all these things. So I sort of had my quite a few years of figuring out all these different pieces that we were going to need to figure out in order to make this into something that was going to become an industry. While I was helping a lot of people start farms, I decided I just wanted to be a seaweed farmer, so I left that position and started Springtide Seaweed in 2017. And also around the same time started the Maine Seaweed Exchange, which is a nonprofit organization where we help train other people to do what we do and try to work together. So we all know where we are in Gouldsboro, but just want to sort of point out in the bigger scheme of things, and I'm appreciating this more and more as I'm working on the water here, is we are in this Frenchman Bay area, which is incredibly important for the wider Gulf of Maine and coastal region. And so if you see this massive Gulf of Maine here, all of the life activity that we all rely upon happens along the coast, and Frenchman Bay is really a unique area in terms of having the cold current coming down here from Canada, especially now as the water is warming so rapidly in southern Maine and mid-coast Maine, and then having this refuge for all of these animals that come into this bay and into the upper bays to breed and to use as a nursery and feeding ground. And to really understand that is part of understanding sort of our modern times, but we have to look back at the history of the fisheries and then also kind of look forward to how the ocean is changing and how do we adapt inside that changing ocean. So I get to sort of look at all aspects of it because I came to Gouldsboro, ended up here because I was farming in Frenchman Bay in this Sorrento farm that had been there formerly as a salmon farm. That's what I was doing my research work on, and then got this other farm here off of Stave Island. And the reason why I have that site is because there was a cod farm that actually was permitted to grow cod there, but they never grew cod there. So I knew about the farm. I figured if I had gone through the process and gotten permission to grow fish, then it should be okay to grow seaweed. So also, we were able to get this facility in South Gouldsboro. And so this is the facility of the old cannery, the old snow cannery, with a really long and interesting history in South Gouldsboro. And this building, these two buildings were part of the factory that was there formerly. And so this is the shot this morning, actually, of the property. And then this is the historical shot. And you can see this is the same building. This part of the building is the same. And then this shed right here is the same. And then all the rest of it is gone. But this was a real factory. It had a smokestack. It had a wharf that went out into the harbor. And they employed a lot of people in the village of South Gouldsboro and Winter Harbor and beyond. And it sort of tells a story of a small slice of the history of Gouldsboro. This cannery was started in the early 1940s, and it was started as sort of a satellite campus for the Pine Point factory, which was located in southern Maine. And they did all sorts of different kinds of seafood here. They did sardines, which were herring. They did clams, mussels, shad, and then they did a bunch of ground fish. And you can see this is the brand name is Winter Harbor American Sardines from the Snow Canning Corporation. And so that was in South Gouldsboro. And this is actually, I just happened to see this one day when I looked up on one of the beams. It says Snow's Flake, Haddock, or Cod, and that's still there in the factory. These images were from my trip to go at the Historical Society, so you can see this is South Gouldsboro, Maine. This is one of the canning tops, and then these labels were actually in the factory when I moved in, and so the address says Pine Point, but these were made in South Gouldsboro. And so we got a lot of our fish locally, so there were weirs in the area. This is Yellow Island, right outside of Bunkers Cove where we are, and so they used to have quite a number of these weirs in the area where they would catch the fish and be able to bring it in. And the factory relied on local fishermen as well as had their own seiners for a while. And so you can see there was a resource here. So there's a wild resource here, and that's why there were factories, because there was enough of a resource that we could have factories that we could process in bulk. And so obviously the fisheries have changed quite a bit, even in a very short time period. And so now the cannery, the old cannery is being turned into a seaweed factory. But after the cannery closed down in the 1950s, it went through a couple of people, but it was operated as kind of a seafood enterprise. And Lenny Bishko built this lobster pound in the 1970s and operated a number of businesses. So he did like every single fishery in his lifetime that came through this area. So he did worms, he did clams, he did crabs, he did lobsters. And so when you kind of look at even the short time span of from the 1940s wasn't that long ago, but you can see this like progression of a tremendous amount and change in fisheries that we've gone through one after the other. And so now when you look out in the harbor, you see there's lobster boats. And so we're kind of down to this really heavy reliance on this one fishery. So the lobster industry obviously is terribly important up and down the coast of Maine, and it's what we rely upon. It is encouraging, though, lately, and being on the water and seeing the changes, is to see the return of the pogies. And we've been watching the pogies every day in and out come into this Bunkers Harbor, Bunkers Cove, and you can see the sort of dark clouds of these fish coming in. And these are a really important keystone ecological species for an area, because they feed on the plankton, they filter feed as they swim through the water, and then they translate that algal plankton into really high value foods. And so these are schools of pogies that are swimming through, and they actually come right into our cove and right into our harbor. And we're starting to see like tremendous wildlife following them around. And so here you can see sort of this dark patch in front of the seal here. And you can actually see these schools of pogies. And I don't know if you've been hearing the planes going overhead, but they actually go up to try to spot them. We had harbor porpoises right in the harbor yesterday, right in front of our facility. And there were just, all the birds and all the creatures are in there feeding on these pogies. And so that's just something I'm really excited about, because I have been reading this book, which I just wanted to recommend to everybody as like, everybody should read this book. It's called The Most Important Fish in the Sea. And it's all about the pogies, and they're called menhaden bunkers, depending where you're from. But it kind of tells the story of our fisheries, the industrialization of our natural resources, and the importance of recognizing our ecosystems as functional systems. And so it's just a terrific book if you get a chance to read it. So seeing the life come back to the sea, seeing the fish come back, it's very encouraging. And it is part of being out on the water every day and being a farmer and having a farm that you're able to observe these changes over time every day. But I am not a fisherman. I don't, my business isn't with fish, it's with seaweed. So I'm here to talk to you about seaweed. And seaweeds are these ancient marine macroalgae that function in the same way that we understand the importance and value and diversity of land plants, but in the sea. And so they're a very mysterious realm because we can't see them. We don't understand all of the systems, how they operate. But they are incredibly important to convert the inorganic world into the organic world. And so they take the solar energy and they turn it into organic matter that can be used then for food, for habitat, for biomass. And we relied on seaweeds for all time. So we have always relied on seaweed as a resource for many, many different purposes, for animal feed supplementation, for food, human food, for insulation, for any kind of sort of thing that we needed, we could get from the seaweeds. And so when we think about what is seaweed good for, well, it's good for pretty much anything. You can use seaweed for pretty much anything. And I tell people, like, whatever you're interested in, I bet I can somehow connect it to seaweed somehow. So everybody, everything, we all need seaweed. So seaweed is sort of like the ocean is our planet, essentially. And seaweed puts the ocean in a form that we can then bring up into our soils and into our bodies and into our systems, which we need those ocean minerals in our systems. And so for like animals, it's always been used as a supplement for livestock, for pets, for any animals, for the same reason that it's good for soils, plants, and people, is that it's the source of these tremendous minerals from the sea, as well as unique bioactive compounds. And by feeding just a little bit of seaweed to the animals as a supplementation, it can greatly improve their health, resistance to disease, and in sort of every avenue that it's been tested, it's created some value. So even like when the bees were all dying, that they were using seaweed to save the beehives. It's like any kind of disease, it can help. And so the same thing for your plants and soils. You can feed seaweed to your soils as an amendment into your plants, and it provides those nutrients that the systems need to fight disease and to do all of their processes that they need to do. For people, sorry, this slide kind of went away from me. So for people, so we create dried seaweed products, and dried seaweed is incredibly condensed and versatile and provides trace minerals that you can't get in a lot of your land plants. And so by adding a little bit to your diet every day in a simple form, gives you the sort of consistency in the mineral intake that you need. Besides that, there are also all these other very interesting health promoting properties. Tremendous source of the electrolytes, has a sodium potassium ratio that's ideal for human health, and just that one thing alone is very interesting because dried seaweed tastes salty, and that's from the potassium that you're getting in it. So when we look at modern diets and our issues around sort of diet-related diseases and high blood pressure, and everybody's trying to cut out the sodium, you still need minerals in your diet. And so by swapping out your table salt with a dried kelp powder, you can help balance all of these systems and get the minerals that you need, and then also add flavor to your food, which is important. Tremendous source of vitamins, tremendous source of ocean-based fatty acid, unsaturated fatty acid, and essential amino acid, and all these sort of unique compounds that only seaweed has. And if you look up kind of health benefits of seaweed, you get all of these antiviral, parasitic, anti-inflammable, antibacterial, antioxidant, sort of all of these things that are really incredible, support your immune system, and has really unique polysaccharides, which are important for your system, can help pull out heavy metals out of your body. Tremendous source of all of these really kind of unique systems to feed your system. So as an ingredient, it's really interesting in terms of looking at how we eat today. We tend to eat a lot of processed foods, a lot of sort of prepared foods. And so even if you could use dried seaweed as an ingredient in some of those products, you could improve the health of the nutrients of those products, which to me is incredibly important and exciting. And then sort of looking at the bigger application of seaweed, there's a huge global industry for just the extracts that they take out of seaweed. So these are complex polysaccharides, and they're used in almost every kind of industry out there. Most of these seaweeds come from Southeast Asia. They're grown on farms. It's a very high volume, low value industry, but these are compounds that we can't synthesize. And so we rely on seaweeds. Much of it is wild harvested, which is becoming more and more of a problem as we lose our important kelp beds around the world. But there's this idea that we could be using seaweed instead of like petroleum, instead of other kind of non-sustainable substrates. We could be using seaweed in place of that. So people are looking at using seaweed to make clothing, to make plastics, to make fuel, to make anything. So you can use seaweed in sort of place of lots of these other compounds. In Maine, we have a wild harvest industry. Quite a number of companies have been wild harvesting. We have tremendous seaweeds in Maine. There's reds, browns, and greens, and so we have Irish moss, we have dulse, this is dulse, and nori are sort of the big red ones that we rely on. So this is one of our species of nori. Nori, as you know, is made into nori sheets and sold in sushi. And then for the brown seaweeds, we have several different kelps. This is horsetail kelp. It sort of splits and has fingers. This is alaria, has a midrib that runs down the blade. And then sugar kelp is a single blade and can be very ruffled on the side. And so just trying to learn all of the different seaweeds. What do we have locally? What are their characteristics, and then how do we grow them on a farm? It's like we're starting from day one in agriculture. And so finding parent stocks to start your farming with is you're looking for characteristics that you would want on your crop. And so the kelp life cycle, the seaweed life cycles can be pretty complicated, but basically they have separated generations. So the large kelp plant that you see in the water is called the sporophyte and produces those microscopic spores. And so the spores are released and swim in the great big ocean and have to find a place to settle. And then they actually develop into separate male and female gametophytes. And so those male and female gametophytes are very, very small, microscopic the male and female sexual phase. And they then have to reproduce and find each other in the great big ocean and reproduce and then produce these tiny kelp plants. And when you look at some of the other seaweeds, the red seaweeds, it's even more complicated. You have like a 3-part life cycle. And so trying to figure out how do we understand how do they operate in the ecosystem, as well as how do we take this life cycle and figure out how to cultivate them. It's not really as easy as going to your corn plant and taking your corn seed and saving it for the next year and putting it in the ground. And so that's part of the challenge here is trying to understand how to control each phase of this cycle. So for kelp, this is how we do it. We take the reproductive tissue, which is called the sorus tissue, and it's a dark patch on the adult plant, and then we just cut that out and clean it up, and you dry it out a little bit, and then when you put it back into seawater, it releases all of its spores. And so these are tiny little microscopic spores, and it creates like a cloudy spore solution. Under the microscope, it just looks like tiny little buzzers just swimming around. They actually have a flagella and they swim around, but they very quickly want to settle on something, attach, and then germinate into their male and female gametophyte stage. And so when they do that, they divide and they make these little filaments. And so these are like very, very small. These are like 20 microns in size. And they have to reproduce. So the female produces an egg and the male releases sperm, and then they have to actually find each other, and then they make this tiny little kelp plant. So this is a juvenile sporophyte, and this is what we produce in the lab, in the nursery. In the nursery, we do all this on string that's wrapped around PVC pipe in a tank in clean seawater. And after a few weeks, once you get them to reproduce, you get this brown fuzzy string, and then that's your seed, and then you can put that out on the farm. So this is the Stave Island Farm right outside the Bunkers Cove. This is kind of how the farm is set up. You have a long line and 2 moorings, and then you have buoys that suspends that long line at the surface. And so this is what it looks like. It's just the mooring balls and then the ropes and buoys in between. So to seed the farm, we seed in the fall. You take your seed spool and you tie off one end, and then you just move it down your rope. And then one end of the rope is attached to a mooring and the other end is attached to a mooring. You put a few buoys in the middle, and then you have it down in the water 5 feet or so. And so you do that in the fall, and you put these tiny little 2-millimeter plants out, and then you wait. And they sort of grow slowly at first, and then they kind of start to pick up speed a little bit. And then in one growing season from fall to spring, they'll grow from 1 millimeter to 10 to 20 feet long. And so this is like a really unique winter farming crop for Maine, because most of us are sitting around waiting for summer in Maine. And you can get tremendous biomass off of these lines. And so that former one was sugar kelp. This is Alaria. So we farm 2 different kinds of kelp. This is also known as wing kelp. This is the one with the midrib down the middle. We're organically certified by the Maine Organic Farmers and Gardeners Association. So we have a process. And so we harvest directly into clean fish totes. We put covers on them. We bring them in directly into the greenhouse. We hang them up, and we use solar energy to dry them. And they're like 90% water. So after you dry it, you get a really condensed product that's easy to store and ship and pack. And then we mill our product, so we make a number of blends, salt-free seasoning blends that use our kelp powder instead of salt. And this is just so that people can try it and get it into their diets and learn and become a little bit more familiar. Mostly though, we sell in bulk to snack food companies. And we've had tremendous help this year. We had a lot of interest, especially from women. This year, they just come and find us, and we're happy to have any kind of help. Doesn't matter who you are, or where you're from, or how old we are. We're so much to do. And right now, we're still trying to finish up harvest season, and I've been harvesting pretty much every single day since April. So trying to get once we get the lines harvested, we bring all of the lines in. We leave the moorings out there. And then bring all the lines in for the rest of the summer, clean them up, and then start the nursery season so we can produce seed for this upcoming fall. And then we do it all over again. So we usually put the seed out in September through November. It grows, and we start harvesting April through July. And so like I said, most of our products we mill and ship in bulk to snack food companies who use it as an ingredient. And it's interesting because there's a lot of options for dried seaweed out there. You can buy truckloads or, I don't know, boatfuls from China for almost nothing. You can buy a lot of dried seaweed from the wild harvesters. But people want to buy from us because they believe in this system, because this is a different kind of system. So as we look at the wild fisheries and how they're changing and how we're always relying on the resource being there and then not being there, and then you go to some other resource, we can grow all of our own resource. So we don't have to go out to the kelp bed and hope that it's going to be there next year, as we can plant our own seed. We can grow so much seaweed on these farms. We could grow so much seaweed in Maine. And so thinking about that as we look to the future in terms of like, what does our marine industry look like in 20 years? If we all are sort of relying on this one fishery and then we don't have a plan, we don't have innovation, we don't have new ideas. And what's been interesting in the past year or so is to kind of see what this town, what this community has been looking at in terms of the other kind of aquaculture. So there's a salmon proposal that is on the other side of town. They also are moving into a cannery and want to do aquaculture, but it's completely different from the system that I'm building, that I'm trying to do. And so to try to look at those and contrast and compare, what do we want our fisheries and our aquaculture and our marine industries and our communities to look like in the future? And how can we build something that brings young people and brings the enthusiasm and brings the resource in a sustainable way that's integrated with the natural systems, rather than relying on these old systems, which is like, somebody's going to come to town and build a factory, we don't know how long they're going to be here for, and then they're going to leave. Because we can grow anything in the ocean once we figure out how, once we have the infrastructure. And so for us to be able to have this facility, now I have a seawater nursery in the basement of this building. I can grow all my own seed. I'm working on figuring out how to grow the red seaweeds, which are more valuable than the kelps because they're higher in plant-based protein. And then I also hatched my first batch of green sea urchins this year. So I can grow sea urchins. I have sea urchins on the farm. And so you kind of look at this and you say, we can grow anything we want. And why aren't we? Our seafood is some of the best in the world. We have some of the best waters in the world, which is why if anybody comes here and tries to impair our water quality, we should all be pushing back on that. And so I think this is a really exciting way, for me anyway, to be more engaged in the natural systems in terms of understanding what is happening in Frenchman's Bay and all the little associated coves and inlets and upper bays, and really start to appreciate sort of the value of this body of water. So that's seaweed farming in 10 minutes. Yes?
Could you talk about clean aquaculture versus dirty aquaculture?
Well, there's, just like lamb farming, you can't just say all agriculture and lump it all into one industry. Like a factory, like a meat factory farm is different than an organic vegetable farm. You know, so when people say aquaculture, we have to be really careful, I think, to make sure we're talking about, to know what we're talking about. So in the scientific world, they call extractive aquaculture and fed aquaculture. So extractive aquaculture is like seaweed and shellfish. So they live in the water and they take all their nutrients naturally from the water, and they're actually extracting nutrients like nitrogen, carbon, phosphorus, plankton, and so they're actually working as part of the ecosystem to promote clean water. Whereas the fed aquaculture, you have to add the feed to the water, which creates, like any normal animal process, waste as well as growth. And so you are actually adding something to the water. And so in terms of when we look at an aquaculture practice, we really have to ask, the biggest question to me is water quality. How are you going to affect the water quality in the area? So this idea of like, if we can promote food production in a way that's sustainable and promotes healthy water quality through things like shellfish, seaweed, echinoderm aquaculture versus like an industrial fish farm where you're going to majorly impact the body of water, then that's really important to understand the difference.
We were down in Eastport a couple of years ago and just paddling, kayaking, and suddenly this large boat showed up and a lot of large dories got off it. And these people started harvesting seaweed. Well, boy, they did harvest it, a lot. Well, anyway, then we went out to Grand Manan, and wow, that's a whole different ballgame. What happens when you discover you've over-harvested it as usual, and it doesn't come back anymore?
What do? We look for the next resource. I mean, that's the problem. I think we need to be, instead of being businessmen and industrial people and economists, we need to be farmers. We need to be like natural observers and participators in the system that we live in. We can't be like, oh, there's a resource over here, let's go get it and make some money. Let's exploit it. It should be like, there's a resource here, it's important to us. How do we live with it in a way that we can benefit from it, but we don't destroy it?
But your model is sustainable, is that right?
Yeah.
How resilient is this system that you're developing to ocean acidification, water temperature change? And if we're looking toward the future, what kind of tolerances are built in here? I mean, what kind of ranges do you need in terms of acidification and temperature to keep this going functionally?
Well, we grow in the winter, so we're still in a geographic area that has those temperature ranges. I think we'll be pretty safe for a while, but the problem with the changing ocean and the changing climate is, and we're seeing on land as well as in the ocean, is the invasive species that are coming in. And so we struggle with that in terms of when there are other organisms coming and landing on your stuff, it shortens your growing season, it causes a lot of waste, and it causes a lot of sort of concern. In southern New England, they're trying to grow kelp, but they have a very short season because it's too warm. And even now, even in southern Maine, it's getting very, very warm. And so what you're seeing is it's becoming more and more hard to find the wild stock to even start cultivation. And that to me is concerning, because if we can't even get started with figuring out cultivation because there's nothing left in the wild, I mean, then we don't have a chance. And it's almost like we have to hurry up and start getting these strains in cycles so that we can create crops out of these sort of local genetic populations. And what I'm finding the more I do it is how different all of these populations and strains are. So if I go get kelp from Taunton Bay versus if I go get kelp from Schoodic, they are completely different plants. And even within an intertidal range, you can find different plants. And that's what's so exciting about this, is like the infinite variety of nature in terms of what we can develop for crops. But if the wild populations aren't even there to start with, then we can't even figure that out. So for the acidification, seaweeds take up carbon, so they actually, it's like fertilizer to them, sort of. But if you do trials in the lab, and you use extremely high levels, it will affect them. But it's not the same kind of concern as you have for like shellfish and crustaceans. When they have developing larval stages, they are more sensitive to acidification.
You mentioned growing sea urchins now. What is their life cycle and how do they tie into the seaweeds?
So sea urchins, I'm trying to remember. So I did my first thing. So you have broodstock and you have males and females and you mix them together, and then they have these planktonic larval stages, which is similar to shellfish, how you hatch shellfish. And then after a few weeks, and they're floating around and feeding on plankton, they settle and metamorphosize into the little tiny sea urchin. And then once they're settled, they're tiny as a pinhead. And then they just sort of feed in a tank until they get big enough that you can put them somewhere else. And so like I hatched mine in April or March or something, and now they're a couple millimeters in size. I just started work with sea urchins because the aquaculture center in Franklin was hatching them and giving me the young ones to play around with, and they eat seaweed. So on a seaweed farm, if I'm out there every single year and I can have a crop that is low maintenance and I just feed them seaweed, so I'm not actually bringing them feed, I'm just feeding them the natural algae that's on the farm. I can put them in cages down low so they're not on the surface because they don't like to get warm. And I've had tremendous success over 3 or 4 years now. They are just happy and living, and very few have died. And so the idea is just like, now that I have a farm, what other things can I kind of integrate into that seaweed operation in a kind of low impact way? Because my main business is seaweed, but if there's other crops I can try to, I'm in really deep water, I'm in 100 feet of water. So if there's other crops I can use and put deeper down, and maybe it will take them 3 or 4 years to grow, but it's adding diversity to the farm and not taking away from my main business. That was the idea. So the potential, I think, with sea urchins is that you can create a really high value uni by feeding them a diet of kelps and red seaweeds, like kelp and dulse. And if you can do that, if you can cultivate a very high quality, consistent uni, you could sell to high-end customers like in Japan that value that kind of quality, and then we could create a whole live market for fed, seaweed grown sea urchins. And so there's so many opportunities in terms of thinking about seafood differently, because right now we mass harvest from the wild, they're beat up, they're sent to a processor in Portland, they take the uni out, and an uni that's been processed versus a live fresh urchin and live uni is like a completely different food. And so thinking about new ways of preparing and selling and growing our seafood, we should be bringing in a lot more value here.
Are there boundaries for this type of thing? Like they have the boundaries for fishing and lobster, like that big chip, where did that come from?
The seaweed harvesting business that operates in down East Maine is actually a Canadian company, but they get harvesters from Maine to get licenses from the state of Maine. So wild fisheries are licensed by the state of Maine. Aquaculture is also licensed by the state of Maine, but in a little bit different way. You have to apply for a lease, and you go through a process and get permission to put your gear there. You have to get permission to put whatever specific organism you're going to cultivate there. But it's all done through the Department of Marine Resources. And so the ocean is owned by the public, but it's managed by the state for the public. And that's why we have licensing and leasing for marine activities.
How does the seaweed affect the natural environment of the bay, either positively or negatively?
The seaweed on my farm is out in 100 feet of water, way offshore from any shoreline, and the bottom is very deep mud. So we just kind of grow at the surface, so we're taking up nitrogen, phosphorus, carbon, and sort of improving the water quality, because we have impacted the cycles, the biogeochemical cycles of all of those things, nitrogen, carbon, phosphorus, and can create problems. In most water bodies, we struggle with an overabundance of nitrogen, carbon, and phosphorus. But yeah, the farm actually creates like a mini reef almost. So we're growing all of this vegetable biomass, this algal biomass, which then can create food, release organic carbon into the environment, and create sort of shelter for other organisms. Like we often bring up lumpfish that live inside of our kelp lines, which are these little fish that they have a sucker on their bottom of their belly, and they eat things off the kelp, and then it just creates this sort of like whole ecosystem of creatures out there. But in terms of like negative impacts, I don't know any. I mean, we take up space, we have gear in the bay. So that is something that's different than what we normally think of, but we also have a lot of lobster gear in the bay. Like each lobsterman has 800 traps, and they lose traps every year. So there's a lot of stuff happening in the bay. There's been more in the summer, there's more and more kind of recreational activity. So I really like to get all my lines out of there and get out of the way during the busy season. And then mostly when I'm out there, I'm the only one out there. So it's in the middle of winter, so.
Where do you think the seaweed that is the waste seaweed from the farm that you don't take back to the land, that is just cut off and is going back into the water, where do you think that might go? Where do you think it might end up?
So that sinks to the bottom and becomes part of the sediment. And there are actually lots of people out there right now trying to figure out how to tap into the global carbon market, because when you put organic matter into sediment in the bottom, whether it's in the soil or the ocean, you can capture that carbon. So you're transporting organic carbon from the surface to the bottom, so that creates food, but it can also be moved into the sediments and then sort of store that carbon. So the ocean has lots of hungry things in it, and the seaweeds and the plankton are that solar engine, just like on land with plants. We need something to turn the solar energy and minerals into an organic form. And once that goes somewhere in the ocean, it gets broken down, it gets fed on by animals, bacteria, other animals, and then gets broken down eventually into the sediments. Or recycled and returned. The nutrients get recycled and returned in the water column.
One more question?
One of your slides showed a number of jars with labels on them. Where can you purchase those?
Right now we sell online, and Dulce and Ragosa has a little shop at the old post office on Route 1. They sell our products. Right now we're in harvest season, so we haven't put them out, but yeah, so online or at Dulce and Ragosa. If you want to come by and visit us, you can come to the factory and I'll sell you some jars of kelp if you want them. We actually, if you ever go to Bar Harbor, Peaky Toe Cafe serves our seaweed salad. They make a really good seaweed salad with our seaweed as a side dish. That's worth a trip. But mainly, the interesting thing is we can't grow and process enough seaweed. And we get requests every single week from some other big company that wants our seaweed. And so here we have this opportunity to create an industry bigger than me and my little operation, and that's the idea. So I train anyone that's interested in learning about seaweed. I will train you how to do what I do. I will help you get certified organic. I will show you the process, and I will try to work. We want to try to create a network of independent farmers that will work together as a larger industry, like collaboratively, to fill these orders. And then once we have farmers, we can share the resources. So we have a mill. So if we can help you get started with a farm, and we can help you with a greenhouse, or help your neighbor with a greenhouse, and we can get that stuff dried, we can mill it on our mill, and we can sell it for you, or you can sell it wherever you want. You can start your own seaweed company. The idea here is that there's so much opportunity, and this is a great place to do it. It's just kind of a matter of seeing it and building out the pieces. So we do need the infrastructure, we need processing, we need the people working on the questions of like, how do we grow more things? And that to me is like many lifetimes of work. But we have a window of time, and we should really be starting to build right now. Otherwise, like, what is our plan for the future when the lobster industry changes, or the ocean changes, or something changes? You know, what is our plan? So if anyone's interested, like I said, feel free to come by, or we have a website, Springtide Seaweed. We also have a website, Maine Seaweed Exchange. We do workshops once in a while, but lately I've just been working on the farm.
Well, thank you very much.